So to get started on today's lesson, just a couple of review questions on our unit on plants and adaptations from those plants. Go ahead and just see if you can identify what environment is best going to fit a plant with large broad leaves, needle leaves, and so on. Okay, and your answers for number one, that's going to be found most likely in a jungle or a forest. Number two, needle leaves are from pine needles, best found in the tundra or a snowy place. Spines are found in deserts. Long roots will also be found in deserts or dry areas. Carnivorous plants, environments with poor soil. Bulbs will be found in places where it gets cold because during those cold seasons, the plant will need to store food and water underground. And then 7, tendrils are going to be found in forests because they can climb up trees to get sunlight. So today's lesson is going to be on natural selection and also genetic variation. The first thing I want you to think about is, how do organisms get such autumn adaptations? So what do I mean by adaptations? I mean cool things that animals and other organisms can do. For example, this chameleon. It can change colors, or it can camouflage with its background environment, or stick out to have such really beautiful coloration. How did organisms get to be so specialized to do those types of things? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to make sure that we're familiar with our vocabulary for today. One of the phrases that you'll need to know is survival of the fittest, natural selection, a scientist by the name of Lamarck, and Charles Darwin. Here in classes where we stop to watch the Brain Pop video on Charles Darwin, and so if you'd like to do that, you can do that now. So one of the vocab words that we learned is survival of the fittest, and what survival of the fittest is basically the idea that some organisms, because they have certain traits that are advantageous or good traits, those organisms are going to be better at finding food, better at finding shelter, and protecting themselves from predators. And because they have those traits that make them better, faster, stronger, they're going to be better survivors. So they will live longer than other animals who don't have those traits, and they're probably going to have more children than animals who don't have the traits of being fastest. So in this example, this group of zebras, a zebra that's going to probably get caught by a lion is one that's just simply not as fast as the most fit members of its species. So in science, fitness doesn't mean that you're working out and being buff. It means that you are able to survive longer and you're more likely to have offspring. So when this happens, if the organisms that keep surviving have these special traits, and organisms that have traits that really aren't helping them survive are getting killed, over time this might mean that that group of organisms is going to have a change in their population. And that change is called natural selection. Very important concept, both on the tests that we will be taking and in biology. So when a species changes over time, and that change helps a species either get food in a better way, reproduce, or protect itself, then that whole process is natural selection. So what I'd like you to do is look at this picture, and you have a picture of 2 birds and a worm. Explain why the bird on the right is more likely to pass on its genes than the bird on the left. And I want you to make sure that in your answer, it should be about a paragraph. Make sure you tell me what trait the bird on the right has, why it's an advantageous trait. Make sure in your answer you use the term survival of the fittest, and make sure that you've actually answered the question, why is this bird more likely to pass on its genes than this bird? Go ahead and pause and make sure you've done that. So here's another story to kind of illustrate for you natural selection and survival of the fittest. So snakes and lizards actually come from a common ancestor. Snakes have not always been around on this earth. And I'm going to kind of illustrate that with a story. Now, this story isn't exactly scientific, but it kind of shows you the process of the scientific natural selection. So let's look at that ancestor of the lizard and the snake. So you can say, once upon a time, there was a group of lizards, and since we'll say that they were related from the same parents, but since there's genetic variation, some lizards are going to be a little bit wider, maybe a little bit chunkier than some of its siblings. So that's just going to happen normally, just like how you look a little bit different from your brothers and sisters. Now, these lizards happen to eat mice, but if there were way too many lizards and not enough food, now these small differences between brother lizards and sister lizards and other lizards in that species, now those differences can be the difference between life or death. If someone is fast enough and faster and able to get more food than the other lizard, then some lizards might end up starving to death. Well, in this case, these mice lived in deep holes in the ground, and so if you were skinny enough to fit into those holes, you were able to get the food faster and more quickly than some of the other lizards. So the fatter lizards would starve to death, and the skinnier ones would live on to reproduce. And then they would be able to reproduce with other skinny lizards that had also survived. But of course, you still have genetic variation, so if you ever ended up with a lizard that was a little bit chunkier, it was not able to get to the food as best as the skinny lizard could. So if you weren't able to get enough food, then you would starve to death while the skinnier one lived to reproduce. Well, this keeps happening until basically anytime you ended up with a chunky lizard, it wasn't able to get the food at all, and so the skinniest and best lizards really started to look much less like lizards and much more like what we would call today a snake. Now, of course, if there was a lizard that was able to find some other food source, then it would continue to reproduce with other lizards, and if they had some other food source that did not live in a skinny little hole, then they could continue on being lizards. But for that other group that was really good at getting those mice, they really started to look more like snakes. And so this whole process is natural selection. We had a change in a species over time, over thousands and thousands of years, that actually helped this particular animal survive better because they were able to get more food. And actually today, if you look at a modern snake, you'll see that there are two little structures on the underside of that snake that really serve no purpose for the snake today. However, they are remnants, or what you might say are leftovers of its lizard-like ancestor. So these used to be the legs and the arms of the ancestor of the lizard, but they are obviously, they don't look much like legs now in a modern snake. None of this would be possible if there wasn't that genetic variation in the species to make those small differences between the two lizards, to make one a better survivor, better at getting food than the other lizard. So in order, you need to have genetic variation. And of course, the one that has the genes and the traits that will make you a better survivor, this contributes to the idea of survival of the fittest. And then fit organisms are able to reproduce and then pass on those fit traits to their offspring. And eventually, if there's a gene that, is not helping you survive, then that gene might disappear from that population altogether. So what kind of reproduction will there be genetic variation in? You should have answered sexual reproduction. And based on these pictures, which beetle is going to be the most fit beetle? You should start looking at this picture and then move to the right. All right, the beetle that is most fit will be the tan one because it is more likely to survive and reproduce. The bird seems to be going for the green ones for whatever reason. So the tan beetle is actually the most fit here. These are just some interesting graphs that we looked at in class. You should be able to look at these graphs and feel comfortable interpreting what they say. And for example, if I asked you a question, which type of beak size, small, medium, or large, will be most favorable during the rainy season? You should look to see that the blue line means rainy. You have 3 different beak sizes, the number of finches or birds that are available at that are living at that time. It looks like the most number of birds are present in the rainy season that have a medium beak size. So that means that if you have a medium beak size, there are a lot of birds around during the rainy season with this particular trait. So that's a good trait to have in the rainy season. But in times of drought, so now we look at the brown line. In times of drought, if you're a bird that has a small beak there are 0 or close to 0 numbers of finches at that time. So that's not a good trait to have in the dry season. So just make sure that you can look at different types of graphs and answer questions about what is going on and what type of trait will make you more successful at a particular time. And here is another question about, a graph about peacocks that you should be able to read and then interpret the chart. And my question for you here is, we'll actually go ahead and read and then pause it. So the question here is, which trait, either shorter, less colorful tails or longer, more colorful tails, would make a more fit peacock? Which peacock demonstrates survival of the fittest here? You should have answered the longer, more colorful-tailed peacocks because they are having much more successful matings than the shorter ones, which are having less than 25% of total mating. And over time, what type of peacock would you expect to see in general? Would you expect, if we waited hundreds of thousands of years, what trait do you think would be the most fit trait to have? You should expect that you would see lots of peacocks with much more longer colorful tails, and peacocks with less colorful tails you would not expect to see at all because they are not mating enough and not passing on less colorful shorter tails to their offspring. I'm going to skip over this. So here are some exit ticket questions that you should feel comfortable answering, particularly after you have watched the brain pop video. You would need the brain pop to answer number 1. And so hopefully this is a good review for you, and good luck studying.